In this episode, we're going to encapsulate our first form element as a base component, and that is going to be the input field. As you can see, I've already created a section for our inputs, so let's get started. Because our forms are always going to be displayed inside a panel, let's also showcase our input fields inside the panel. Okay, so ideally we want a base input component that has a label props that will automatically be displayed on top of the field. Let's call that one name. And I also want us to be able to define a type props that will define the type of our input. So for example, if it's a text, if it's an email, if it's a date, etc. So let's copy paste that and say date of birth, type, date. And when that's not provided, I want it to default to text. So we shouldn't have to write type text here. I am, however, going to give it a little bit of margin so that they're not stuck together when displayed. Okay, so let's create that base input component. We'll start by importing it. Input. And we'll create it in the component directory, base input. Okay, so for our root element, we'll be using a label tag, which will be displayed as a block. And the advantage with this is that any text that is inside that label block will automatically be associated with the input field. So inside we'll have two elements. We'll have the text labeling the input, which is defined as the label props. And right next to it, we will have the input itself. So let's start with the label. We first need to register it as a props. And that will be a string. Okay, so let's style that a little bit better. We'll make the text smaller, bolder, and we'll give it a little bit of a margin bottom. We'll also make sure that the label is displayed only if it was provided, so vif label. Okay, so now for the input, we said we want to allow the type to be given as a props, but we want it to default to text when it's not provided. So let's do that. We'll add type, which is of type string, and the default is going to be text. And let's use that new props here. Okay, so we can already see that the name field is a regular text input, whereas the date of birth field has already been altered by the browser. Now, speaking of browsers, they have a great deal of influence on how an input field looks like. For starters, we have the same issue we had with buttons, which is when we focus an input element, its outline depends on the browser, but also your operating system. And we'd like that to be consistent across every platform. But with form elements, a lot more is dependent on the browser. We're talking line heights, font size, spacing, etc. And all of that requires quite a lot of Tailwind CSS classes just to have forms that are consistent on every platform. Fortunately, there is an official Tailwind CSS plugin called Custom Forms, and that plugin does exactly what we want, which is to provide a better starting point for form elements instead of having to write complex CSS necessary to style form elements across browsers. And if we scroll down a little bit, you can see that this is what the form elements look like after we apply the plugin. So we're definitely going to update that design to our needs, but at least it provides a nice canvas for us to start with. Okay, so let's install it. We also need to add it as a plugin in our Tailwind configuration file. And finally, in our base input component, we can add the form input class to apply those changes. So if I save this and go back to our Paparazzi application, we can see that those styles have been applied to our inputs. And for example, if I now focus the name input field, we have that same blue outline that we had before with the buttons. But let's improve on that design. So we're going to make that a block that takes the entire width available. We're going to give it a gray background with a border that matches that color exactly, so gray 200. And finally, I want the background to be white when we are focusing the element. So now if I click on the name input, we can see the blue outline as well as the white background. And the same goes if I tab into date of birth. Okay, so that's all for the design of our input field, but now we need to make sure that they are reactive. That means when we v-model a variable in our base input, we want that variable to be automatically updated when we update the for. Okay, so let's go back to our app.view file. And as you can see, I've created two variables here called name and date of birth. And I'm going to use v-model here and here with those variables. So v-model name and date of birth. And to show that this is working, I'm going to display them as text underneath the fields. Okay, so now the question is, how do we actually use that v-model in our base component? The important thing to know here is that v-model is actually syntactic sugar for defining the value props and the input listener. So v-model name is actually equivalent to value name and then an input listener that listens for a value and then assign it to the name property. So now that we know that v-model is equivalent to that, all we have to do is define a value props, which we will be feeding to our input field. And every time that input field updates, we emit a new input event with that value. If it still sounds a bit confusing, I think it will make more sense when it's implemented. So let's do that. We'll delete that line and go back to our base input. And let's start by defining that value props here. And we'll give null as a type because it can be anything. It can be a number, can be a string, we don't care. Next, all I have to do is provide that value into our input tag. So we will indent that a bit and do value equals value. Okay, so now whatever we provided in v-model will automatically be displayed on our input field. So if I go back to app.view, and here I replace name with foobar and I save, you can see that foobar is automatically inserted in the input field. The trouble is, if I try and update foobar directly in the input, it doesn't update what we have in our variable. So that's the next step. Let's go to our base input and we'll add a listener. So whenever something changes in the input field, emit a new input event with event target value. So now we should have two-way binding, right? We should have a binding from the parent element to the child element and from the child element to the parent element. So if I save this and refresh this, we can see that we still have foobar, which is the initialization of that variable. But this time, if I change something, it gets automatically reflected here. And exactly the same goes for our date of birth. I know v-model can be confusing at first, but once you know how to use it, it's a great tool to design custom components, and base components are the perfect example of this. In the next couple of episodes, we'll be using v-model again as we define our select fields and checkboxes.